Welcome to the Deep Dive Spirituality Conversations podcast. I'm your host, Brian Russell, and today it's a real privilege to have on the show Mark Tooley, president of the Institute for Religion and Democracy. Mark, welcome, and thank you so much for being on the show today.
Great to be with you, Brian. I've been looking forward to it.
Yeah, can you just talk a little bit about some key moments in your spiritual journey that led you to your present role as the president of the IRD?
I grew up in a United Methodist church, so I'm lifelong and cannot ever issue a blanket denunciation of my denomination because I owe it so much. It shaped my own faith, and so much of what I am, I must credit to United Methodism. But as a young man, I became involved in Methodist polity. I was sent off as a member of the Virginia Annual Conference at age 20 and became missions chair for my congregation shortly afterwards. Became disturbed about the politics and the social witness of the Methodist agencies starting in the late 1980s at that time, and made it my cause to repair some of those issues, especially at the denomination's General Board of Global Ministries, which at that point had really backed away from missions evangelism and was completely beholden to extreme forms of liberation theology. So my journey in terms of Methodist Reformation now dates back over 30 years, and it's very exciting for me, and I know for many others that perhaps we're starting to open up the final chapter of that journey as the denomination heads towards likely a separation this year and the creation of a global Methodist church that will be Orthodox and hopefully can start to reverse the severe declines of Methodism in the United States of the last 55 years.
Yeah, can you tell our listeners a little bit more about what the Institute for Religion and Democracy, or the IRD, is? You know, what its goals are, what the roots were, and just so not in case some of our listeners have never heard of the organization. What do you all do?
Yes, the IRD will celebrate its 40th anniversary this year. I've been there for, I'll celebrate my 27th anniversary later this year. It was founded in 1981 during the Cold War as an ecumenical Christian think tank. So Protestants, evangelicals, Catholics, Eastern Orthodox, but Methodist played the initial role in our founding in that it was Methodist layman David Jessup, who worked for the AFL-CIO trade union, who was liberal politically, felt very strongly about democracy and human rights, worked with overseas trade unions to fight the influence of Marxism, and so was very concerned when his children came home from a Methodist Sunday school raising money for the church's missions board that he realized was funding or involved with overseas Marxist causes. He ended up, after he went to the 1980 General Conference, met evangelist Ed Robb from Texas, who agreed with him that these challenges needed to be addressed. So they pulled in some leading Christian thinkers, Richard Newhouse, who was then Lutheran, later Roman Catholic, Michael Novak, the Catholic ethicist, George Weigel, Catholic, later the official biographer of Pope John Paul II, Carl Henry, the founding editor of Christianity Today magazine, and others to essentially make the case for a Christian political and social witness that affirmed democracy, human rights, and religious liberty for all people everywhere.
And can you talk a little bit about what you consider to be the sort of essential core theological, philosophical commitments that should undergird political involvement and activism by Christians? What are some principles that Christians ought to keep in mind to become politically active and to get involved in the very things that IRD cares about?
Well, IRD's founding statement, which you can still find online, written by Richard Newhouse, is called Christianity and Democracy, which outlines those principles, but essentially it says the church to serve society has, first of all, to be the church and to be faithful to its calling to Christ, faithful to its doctrines and historic teachings, absent which it cannot be a faithful witness in society. But also remembering the church is not primarily a political instrument. Obviously, it's primarily to proclaim the gospel, to evangelize, to disciple, to offer ministries of compassion to those in need, but it does need to speak to society, and it does need to expound biblical ideas about the dignity of all people, all of whom bear the image of God, and all people, therefore, regardless of their religious faith or their politics, are deserving of equality and treatment in every society, in law and in custom. We also have to remember that the members of the church and all members of society are fallen human individuals, so we must be very, very wary of perfectionist or utopian political and social schemes. We can't build our politics or pursue a society that assumes that people are anything other than what they are. Very few societies have very many sanctified saints, so we can't expect society as a whole to behave in a sanctified manner.
Yeah, those are really just good, sobering words to reflect what you just said there. So it really sounds like, in a sense, we have to make sure we have a robust doctrine of sin, yet simultaneously recognize the dignity through the being created in God's image, and those are so important to be able to hold those together. What's your advice for Christians? I mean, we're both on Twitter, and we kind of see what goes on with Twitter, and it's pretty harsh, even among Christian pastors debating politics and such. And it seems like so many, in some ways, regardless of one's political allegiances, it's easy to get co-opted into a particular candidate or whatever. But do you have advice? How does the IRD help Christians to navigate kind of how to participate in the political sphere, even in a political party, if you will, without really compromising their allegiance to Christ's kingdom? Ultimately, and again, I'm not trying to be utopian, but what are some of what are some advice that you have for Christians who want to get active and to stay Christian first while simultaneously, being influential in a particular, say, political party?
Well, we espouse a form of Christian realism, which is often associated justifiably with the mid-20th century Protestant thinker Reinhold Niebuhr, but it actually is much deeper than that. It's Augustinian. It stresses the fallenness of all humanity, but it's not despairing because it believes in God's grace and divine intervention in society. So we should aspirationally pursue just societies, but be very cautious in what we anticipate and not demand perfect solutions. So should Christians be involved in politics? Well, many are called. We shouldn't assume that all are called. It's not mandatory, obviously. Should Christians be loyal to political parties? Well, in a democracy, that is necessary. Democracies require political parties and different partisan perspectives and loyalties to those parties. But obviously, all loyalties for Christians are ultimately to the divine reality and to Christ himself, not to party and not to nation. But I think it's important to keep in mind that shouldn't be a dichotomy, and that if you want to pursue God's purposes, you want your nation and society to pursue God's purposes. So there's not, properly understood, ever a choice between nation and God, because if a nation is going against God, that's not in the national purpose. It's in the national purpose to pursue, I think, righteousness at all times.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. So when we take the United States, and again, I wanted to have you on the show in 2021. I didn't know we were going to have you right on the show a week after kind of have a real mess at the Capitol. We've had a contentious election season, to say the least. What are your thoughts right now? I mean, you work in Washington D.C., so you literally been there for history kind of unfolding over the last few months. I mean, what are your thoughts on the present political realities in the United States, and in particular, maybe the relationship between the church and politics? Or you can comment that on any way you want. But what are you seeing in terms of the political realities? And what are your thoughts about what's going on right now in our country?
Yes, I've had a front row seat to much of what has unfolded in the nation over the last year. Our office is a few blocks north of the White House, and our office has been open since June. So we've seen a lot of the BLM protest, and during the extreme, there was one night of rioting and violence in May. That was the night before President Trump's famous march through Lafayette Park. So the windows of our office building were smashed
Wow.
that Sunday night. Obviously, our streets downtown DC are closed today in preparation for next week's inauguration. I walked down to the U.S. Capitol last night to see all the National Guard around the Capitol and throughout downtown DC. So it's very dramatic and unlike anything in my over 50 years of living here in Washington, D.C. The events of January 6th are without precedent, deeply disturbing, essentially a violent mob attempting to overthrow the government and the Constitution of the United States. It was violent and murderous, but also somewhat comical. It never had any chance of success, but deeply disturbing in that many Americans seem to sympathize with the mob's aspirations, and many more believe in the conspiracy theories that fueled the mob. So this is, once again, a failure of the church. Purportedly, seemingly, many people who were in that mob or supportive of it identify as Christian, ideally would know better. I don't think Christians believe in vast conspiracy theories if they have a realistic assessment of human nature and its limitations, and if they believe in divine sovereignty. I also think the assault on the Capitol was essentially although many people there claim to be Christian, if you look at the Proud Boys who were leaders in that mob, and some of the more colorful characters, the QAnon shaman, who is now an international celebrity, that this was really a post-Christian, neo-pagan will for power for its own sake, based on conspiracies in which we create our own reality. The extreme voter fraud scenarios basically are a right-wing equivalent of the transgender mythology. We all get to define for ourselves what truth is. So the church ideally should be countering all of that, teaching that there is an objective reality that all of us can know by the grace of God, and that we are called to be good and responsible citizens, not extremists, but seeking social harmony while also witnessing to the unique claims of our own faith.
Yeah, that's really a helpful assessment, and you alluded to what the role that perhaps churches could play or maybe haven't played. So I have a lot of pastors that listen to the podcast, and also spiritual leaders that are significant in their congregation and such. So I mean, like, what are common mistakes that you see as the president of the IRD? You think about the relationship between really good politics and also Christianity on a daily basis. So what are some common mistakes that you see in pastors, if you could speak to that, in either how they kind of siphon or silo out politics from their ministry, or maybe get too involved and make their ministry all about identifying with a certain political position? You see common mistakes that maybe pastors make that if they could step back and say, hey, maybe I need to pivot a different direction?
Well, it goes without saying it's very, very difficult for pastors to address these issues, and they typically have very little training in it. So they're pretty much on their own. But as a general rule, I would say pastors do not have if they're pastoring a church, they don't have a vocation for addressing political specifics. Their vocation is to proclaim the gospel from the pulpit and to offer ministry to their congregation. But I do think they have a responsibility to teach basic principles about Christian responsibility in society. I appreciated that the pastor of the church I attended this last Sunday, just very briefly before his sermon, referred to the American flag standing off to the side in the sanctuary. It said the flag was there as a reminder of our liberties and of our responsibilities, and we pray for our nation. Now, I know some people don't like flags in the sanctuary, but I would argue they have a useful utility if they are a reminder of where God has placed us in time and place, and where we are civically responsible.
Yeah, I think that's actually a good framing of the American flag. That's exactly right. That can be really controversial, but if it's understood in that context, it does make some sense. Other people will try to say it means other things, but I like how you just explain that. What about what's the danger? And we've seen it on our time, and again, I'll take my limited sample on Twitter. I end up having, I follow a lot of pastors and from on that take different positions. A lot don't say anything, but I've noticed this during this last cycle, a lot of pastors have just flat out become partisan, either again one way or the other. And I always wonder, that seems risky because at some level, if I'm the pastor and I'm signaling partisanship, that seems like I'm cutting myself off from my ability to reach maybe 50% of the population with the gospel. If politics becomes the way to get in there, and again, certain denominations get associated with parties. We know that, but what would be your word to someone who maybe has gotten I don't know, co-opted by a certain kind of political engagement, so they're only associated with that? How would you step back from that? If what would your advice be to that person who's maybe got way too involved over the last year and needs to like back up just for the sake of being more missional to their whole community?
Talking about the clergy.
Yeah, I'm talking about clergy in particular. I mean, obviously, yeah. I'm really just thinking of clergy that have taken really strong positions. And again, I'm not talking about denouncing violence, because that makes sense. But if you were going to literally get co-opted and go vote for this person or vote for that person, which I think we've seen, at least in my estimation, I've seen that more in this last election cycle than, at least in my memory. And maybe I wasn't paying attention. It just seems like it's a lot more explicit partisanship now coming straight from the clergy. And I wonder how wise that is.
I think generally it's not very wise at all for clergy pastors to tell their flocks how to vote. They should be sharing basic principles of citizenship and essential Christian moral teachings. For example, God ordained the state to uphold basic public order, and Christians should seek policies that defend life and human dignity for all. But going beyond that in terms of candidates and legislation, I think that's beyond the purview of a pastor.
And since you've been on the inside, I mean, you've been in DC, and again, it doesn't mean you know all kinds of actual politicians, but you're there, you see the culture, so you've seen, at least at some level, kind of an insider to what goes on for our federal government. What are some things that you wish more, pastors and Christians who don't live in Washington, D.C. actually knew about the U.S. political scene? Are there some obvious things that most people don't know that would be helpful for them to know?
Well, maybe they often make the mistake of either overly demonizing it or overly sacralizing it, and fail to understand that politicians are just simply people, not very different from ourselves, with the same motivations. Maybe their personalities are a little bit extreme, and that they tend to be very driven and ambitious and very energetic, maybe sometimes demonically so. But I think that we should be cautious about placing too much hope in them, but also we should avoid disdaining them, and just have a realistic appraisal and expectation of what they can accomplish. We appreciate those politicians whom we support most enthusiastically. They're still frail, sinful human beings who are going to disappoint, and the politicians we oppose and most demonize, once again, they're still just people, and they have their sins, but they probably also have their virtues.
In terms of like the United Methodist Church, again, you said you've been a lifelong United Methodist. Influential kind of evangelical or conservative Methodists were really influential starting the IRD. But when you think of the bigger United Methodist Church, what does it mean that, like our church, the United Methodist Church, has had so many presidents actually, and even influential Congress men and women who have actually been Methodists? You would know more than me, but I know the Bushes were Methodist, Hillary Clinton, I think Bob Dole. And I'm sure there's a whole kind of laundry list. You mentioned Jeff Sessions from Alabama. What's it mean that we have a denomination that actually has people from both kind of the left and right in that? And in what ways is that healthy? In what ways is that is that ever problematic to have such a big kind of a big tent in terms of politics in one denomination? And what is it about Methodism that perhaps has attracted so many different types of political leaders?
Well, actually, Methodism, given its vast size throughout American history, has not had very many presidents. Presidents tend to be Episcopal or Presbyterian, which I guess are the more, arguably the more prestigious mainline denominations. But the only Methodist presidents have been, as you mentioned, George W. And you have to go back 100 years to the last one before that, William McKinley. And there were only a couple before that. So, but Methodism does produce a lot of leaders and a lot of members of Congress. And even now, the mainline denominations, even in their shrinkage, produce a disproportionate number of members of Congress. But you're right, Methodism and most of the mainline denominations are well known for being places where persons from both parties and in between did worship. And that was the great public service that these denominations across the centuries offered, in that they were not partisan, but they were places of mediation, and advocated good citizenship and basic principles about democracy and human dignity, and created a wider sense of, again, it's often derided, and I think wrongly so, civil religion that was based on biblical principles, but was vague enough in its rhetoric that it was very inclusive of all the Protestant denominations and could include Catholics and Jews and others, in its basic premise that the nation had to pursue or should pursue godly principles, and our rulers were subordinate to a transcendent authority. With the decline of Methodism and the other mainline denominations, we have lost that wider sense of civic responsibility and social solidarity, and civil religion is in decline. We're far more polarized. It's often repeated, white evangelicals are 80% Republican. Other groups are equally polarized. The mainline Protestants are still maybe 50-50 right-left, but they're, as stated, a shrinking percentage of the population. But my hope is that the example and the traditions of the mainline Protestants can still be models for wider Christianity, especially now that evangelicalism is in such a crisis and lacks since it's not really rooted in a deep tradition, it lacks what the mainline Protestants had in terms of their understanding of God's purposes for the government, their own traditions having dated back to the Reformation, of course, and were deeply intertwined with the development of American democracy across several centuries.
From your perspective, given the country's made shifts, and at some level, at least among Anglos, I mean, there's still a sizable amount of population that participates in worship. That probably hasn't changed that much, but in a sense, you have a large block, especially among Anglos. Again, among our minority groups, there's still heavy participation in churches, but with sort of loss of faith in certain parts of the country. Again, it depends where you live to how true that is among real vibrant Christianity. What do you sense that there's actually maybe threats to religious liberty in the United States in ways that there weren't in the past? I mean, so what would you say? What's the present state of, say, religious liberty from the perspective of the IRD in the United States today?
Yes, IRD was founded, as mentioned, 40 years ago, especially to advocate on behalf of religious freedom for all people, because during the Cold War, obviously, religious believers were severely persecuted behind the old Iron Curtain in the Soviet bloc, and many American churches were not just silent about it, but often making excuses for it for wider political purposes. So we thought it should be central to Christian social and political witness that religious freedom for all be advocated. I think the IRD's founders never imagined that would be a serious issue in the United States, and you're right to ask the question, because religious freedom is an issue in the United States, not like it is in China, obviously, right. But in terms of obviously the LGBTQ issues and the LGBTQ orthodoxy, that has been clashing with the rights of traditional religious believers over the last 10 years. And I do think it is important that Christians and other believers in freedom of speech and religious freedom affirm that all people should be able to practice and live out their faith without coercion.
And do you see, when you think about the future, I mean, even with, have you seen shifts in people's expectations of what government could do for them? I mean, it's called the Institute for Religion and Democracy. Again, our country's, the United States has struggled at different times. There's been division at different points in our history, and there's even been, teetering back and forth between tinkering with more socialistic practices at different places, and sometimes the pendulum swings back and you get more freedom. Do you have a sense that the country's at a place where it's losing confidence actually in democracy? I mean, we talked about this kind of conspiracies on the right about voter fraud. That jumps back and forth. Do you think democracy is actually under threat in the United States? And if so, what role might persons of faith play in creating a more hospitable environment for democratic values to actually flourish? Is that some question that you could answer?
Yes, I'm confident long term that the DNA of America is so richly imbued with democratic principles that our democracy will survive. It's hard to overturn a whole nation whose history dates back centuries and is more deeply rooted in the whole Anglo political tradition, but we should be alarmed. And yes, there are threats to our democracy from all directions. So the far left, with their narrative that America is intrinsically evil and was founded and based on racial supremacy and oppression, that's a misreading of history and a threat to democracy. We have a small but significant movement among far-right Catholics called integralism that rejects quote-unquote liberalism and wants to return to a time when, once again, quote-unquote, the church is paramount in society, so a semi-theocratic arrangement. I've been waiting for, among right-wing evangelicals, for Reconstructionism to resurface, which would be a partner of sense to Catholic integralism. I don't really see it yet, but we have what many are deriding or labeling Christian nationalism, extreme forms of which were very much present in the assault on the Capitol on January 6th. I'm not entirely comfortable with the term Christian nationalism. I think it's maybe too sweeping, and it would, taken literally, condemn, for example, how mainline Protestants have talked about the country. For most of their history, I think churches do have to talk about, at least speculatively, God's purposes for the nation. But clearly, there are extreme elements behind the attempt to overthrow the Constitution last week on Capitol Hill that claim to be Christian and somehow conflate the nation with their own religious perspective. And obviously, that's extremely dangerous and must be rebutted. I criticize the term Christian nationalism, but I can't offer an alternative term to replace it. Some people are referring to a form of a folk religion, but we need a better terminology to describe it. But all of those movements are threats to our democracy.
No, that's good. And so when you think about, I mean, we may have touched this a little bit. I mean, I always thought, like, what would I have preached if I was a pastor in a local church this last Sunday? And I talked to a lot of pastors on a weekly basis in the work that I do, and I know that they were kind of struggling for a particular word. But one sermon isn't a response to all the things that you just said. We see so many pressures from the left and from the right, from really the digital media, and the way that we're both disconnected from the people that live next to us, yet completely connected with everybody at the same time online. So we just get all of this kind of antagonisms. It just gets heightened. So how would you see the role of pastors, of local churches, the Church of Jesus Christ, if you will, serve? In what ways can the church, again, serve as a kind of a healing balm to the divisions in our nation and our world. And again, not as an end in itself. Obviously, we want to see the gospel flourishing and people transformed. And to use Methodist language, we want people to be, we want to spread scriptural holiness, not just across our own country, but across the whole world. But in what ways do you think churches, pastors, committed Christians can be part of the solution in our, and just even if we just want to say start in the United States, again, there might be people around the world listening, so this would be applicable, I guess, in some ways in their context. But given that in the divisions that we see in the U.S., how can churches be part of the solution, would you say? What would be, do you have some practical advice for pastors and Christian lay people?
Well, especially in light of the events of January 6th, it's absolutely essential that churches not be primarily weapons of culture war. So there are clergy and Christians on the left and the right who have a siege mentality and believe that they should be and summoning their parishioners to be at war at all times with the enemy, however that is defined. Churches absolutely must be faithful to their doctrines and teachings and to espouse them no matter how they are regarded in wider society. So in that sense, the church obviously is always in spiritual warfare, but the church is also a servant to society and wants good for all people, not just for the church. So that means the church is not only contending for the faith, but also advocating or needs at this point in history to rediscover the instruments for social unity, or what the Catholics call social solidarity, what themes, what causes and purposes will bring us together as a society and will, to the extent possible, unify us. Obviously, the church's teachings about all of us being created in the image of God. So we are all brothers and sisters in that sense, if not in faith, then certainly by the fact that we are all bearing the image of God. So the church was going to have to creatively develop new ways to express this calling to a social solidarity. And for American Christians, and many will be reluctant, I think, to accept this point, but we do need to avoid polarization, division, and further violence, we do need a national unity. So you may not like the term nationalism, but whatever people want to call it, there are going to have to be some basic spiritual themes about what pulls us together as a national community and society.
That's actually really important, I think, what you just said. And the church actually has resources to think through that thing, even if we don't want to say national. Again, I don't have any problem with the word national because we are, I mean, God forbid if we're going to live in the United States, we are part of a national, we have a national government. And again, conservatives and liberals can just disagree on how big it should be or how much authority it should have, but we still are part of a big umbrella, and to me, I like to keep things, relatively simple. I mean, I think at some level, the classic Christian doctrine of love your neighbor as yourself is really an umbrella to begin to do that. I know, personally, I mean, I guess living in Orlando has been helpful for me because, Florida, it's gone back and forth red and blue since I've been living down here. And I live in kind of this I-4 corridor, which again, it's sort of a swing part of the state. The particular part of Orlando, I guess, would be heavily Democratic, but it's also majority minority. So I just have the privilege of living around really just kind of a snapshot of all the different little demographics in the United States. And that's a blessing because, I know people. I have really good friends that are, hardcore Democrats. I even have some good friends that I think, they wouldn't be violent socialists anyways. They're not like looking for the overthrow, but they would really want to have, kind of classic leftist policies, more like say European governments. And I also know really conservative people and libertarians, and and I consider that a privilege to have those friendships. But I also know, just from talking to people, that my place where I live is kind of unique in that in most places where you live, it's you don't get a lot of flavor. You just get like one piece. But I know all these people, they're all Christians, which to me is awesome, right? So when I think, what's a Christian look like? What political party are you? It's I can't answer that because I can see faces and I know a lot of people who they vote for, and I consider that a blessing. But how do we help persons that maybe live, you see the maps when you take a picture of the United States, you get that picture of like red and blue, and some of that's distorted because it's not like it's 100 to 0 in those places. But at the same time, we tend to, the coasts tend to be heavily Democratic, and maybe in certain counties extremely Democratic, and then you get into Middle America and you see, or rural areas, it's very much Republican. So how do you break down the walls and build some bridges if you say you're kind of maybe more isolated in one of these places where most people really aren't like you, or if everybody is like you? How do you build bridges, would you say?
Well, firstly, avoid living on the internet, which by itself creates a false reality and often is an effort to build a pseudo community with people you think are aligned with yourself, and again, creates kind of a fantasy world. So get out and deal with real people physically. And if you do so, I think that you will understand that they are not necessarily the enemy as you may construe if you're strictly on the internet. If you're a Christian, obviously, you have to see all people, no matter how wrong they may be on issues, they're still not that different from you. They're still no more, no less fallen than you, and they still bear God's image. So you can't trust them completely in the same way they can't trust you completely, but yet you still have to treat them with dignity and respect because of who created them. So I think those are the basic principles, and don't prioritize politics. You should be a good citizen, you should be well informed, but for most people, I'm not sure for anyone, it shouldn't be the center of your life, and that shouldn't define your ultimate reality.
Yeah, that's a good word. It seems like, at least again, for at least if you just go by the internet, some people have made it kind of their almost their religion in a sense, and that's perhaps we just maybe like you just said, take a deep breath and step back. And that's what I've even done throughout 2020. Again, I'm pretty sensitive, and so I get really upset, nervous by all the things that have happened, and then I just go for a walk in my neighborhood and start talking to people, and it's like, okay. It's just, we got to continue to be neighbors to each other, and then work for these things together, sort of structurally. A couple kind of two more kind of big questions, and we'll do some kind of easy questions here at the end. Maybe you've touched on these already, but what from your perspective as president of the Institute for Religion and Democracy, what are your biggest fears about the future of both Christianity and let's just even say freedom? So the value of freedom, and then just Christianity. What are your fears about that, looking towards the future?
Well, too many American Christians are despairing and despondent about the future of Christianity. Obviously, globally, as we know, Christianity is growing. There are more Christians than ever before. It's growing. It's, by some counts, it's the fastest growing faith in the world. Depends on how you count it. Others would claim Islam is certainly charismatic Christianity, or Pentecostal Christianity by itself is the fastest growing religious movement in the world, and that is reshaping the global church, and we're feeling the impact of that in the United States. In terms of the church's role in the U.S., I think there is too much of a narrative of decline. Everyone talks about the growth of the religiously unaffiliated, the religious nuns, as they're called, and that's a real thing. But too often it's not people necessarily losing their faith. It's people no longer affiliating institutionally with any kind of religion. By many counts, the people who are actively practicing their faith in terms of public worship, that's remained relatively steady.
Yes.
But the disturbing and sad part is it was helpful to have people even loosely institutionally affiliated, even if they were not regular worshipers, in that it did tie them into a wider community that's now lost. And again, that's contributing to polarization and ultra individualism, and a loss of attachment to wider communities. So I think Christianity has a great opportunity this year and in the future, in that the social upheavals of 2020 and the rise of the BLM movement and counter movements on the right, which really are searches for spiritual truth, show that, well, humanity is intrinsically spiritual, but Americans, especially because of our history, are religious by nature. And it could be good religion, it can be bad religion, but Americans are religious. So I think the church has an opportunity to invite Americans back into traditional Christianity. But to do that, we're going to have to rediscover who we are and reconnect with our own histories and principles, and realize that just as the religious nuns are sort of making it up as they go along, too much of American Christianity is just making it up as it goes along.
That's good. And I think you've partially answered the follow-up. I was going to ask you what makes you optimistic, and you've talked about the global movements, Pentecostalism, the growth of Christianity. Is there other things that you would point as markers for optimism as we move into 2021 and try to move away from January 6th and look towards the future? What makes you optimistic about the future?
Well, I would highly recommend the British historian Tom Holland's book, Dominion, that came out last year. It's basically a history of the triumph of Christianity in ways that even Christians don't imagine, and that Christian principles about human equality have now been universalized. Not that they're necessarily upheld or respected, but almost every society now, thanks to the influence of the gospel directly or indirectly, now has these certain expectations about how people should be treated, and we need to step back and appreciate that fact and realize where we are for all of the horribles that we've experienced over the last year. We're still, by and large, in many ways, in a better place than we were in the past, and God is redeeming his world, and his work has not stopped. So if we truly believe in his sovereignty, we have to accept that, and we're not, as we imagine, in a constant death spiral.
That's a really good word. So you live in Washington, so you get to see kind of the good and the bad, and some of the hidden things that the other people don't see. You've been engaged in renewal movements within the United Methodist Church, and those have been some difficult fights for a long time. So you've been in kind of in the fire for decades now, in your different roles that you've had. What practices, this is more of a personal question now, what practices keep you spiritually grounded, vibrant, and fired up about keeping going? I mean, how do you stay rooted, Mark?
Well, this is an obvious point, but it has to be stated. You need to go to church every week.
Let's go.
You can't take a break from that. There was a fascinating article in the Washington Examiner about many who participated in the events of January 6th, identifying as Christian. And the quotes he presented were people who, yes, I'm Christian, but I don't go to church. I read the Bible and I read stuff off the internet. And that's part of the problem. You can't be part of the body of Christ if you're not physically with the body of Christ. Again, you can't just make it up on your own. I think having a sense of history and appreciating that it's often been worse in the past. There's so many lessons there, how people have, through their faith, have triumphed over far worse adversities. I noted a couple of days ago the quote from Winston Churchill late in life, that reflecting, he thought that 1940 was the greatest year of his life. Well, that was a horrible year, but he thought it was the greatest year of his life because that was when everything was at stake, and everything he had been trained to do and to believe in was suddenly able to deploy in defense of everything that was good and decent for his country and for the world. So I think that's the way that Christians should see themselves. God has placed us where we are at that moment to address particular crises and challenges. So difficult, but just be honored that you've been commissioned for those purposes.
That's actually a great word, Mark. So thanks for sharing that. Besides the Bible, for you, what have been 2 or 3 books that have shaped you deeply?
Well, that's a very hard question, and I've already mentioned one, which is just a very recent book by Tom Holland, but I thought it was so wonderful about the triumph of Christianity. It speaks so much to those who are constantly in a despondent mode. As a Methodist, as a very young man, I read a book, maybe scholars wouldn't treat it very seriously, but it was a biography of John Wesley called The Burning Heart.
That's a great book.
Which I really enjoyed and found inspirational. And then maybe related to our current conversation, I think that Methodism, as it reorganizes, and if it's going to speak to the current moment, at least in America, is going to have a vibrant political and social witness that is not ideological and is not just a checklist of issues, but really reattaches to the Wesleyan tradition and applies those principles to society. And the only great book on that topic that has been written is called Politics and the Order of Salvation, written by a still alive and now long since retired professor at Candler School of Theology. And I'm sorry, I'm momentarily forgetting his name, but it really has a profound analysis of John Wesley's appreciation that the what he calls the political image of God is written on every human heart. And though it's degraded by the human fall, it is not erased. And so as we understand that political image imprinted on every human being, how does that work itself out in political theology? So that's the question that we as Wesleyans are going to have to address if we're going to be successful in transforming society in a positive way.
And was it Theodore Weber? Is that the book?
Yes, Weber.
Okay, I just looked. Yeah, thank you, Amazon, real quick for that information. Yeah, would you mention anything else besides Burning Heart, Politics of Order and Dominion? Is there another favorite that you have, or?
Well, I'm reluctant to mention any other books. Obviously, if you were my generation trying to become more serious intellectually when you were in college, the authors you read were C.S. Lewis, obviously, who was still read. I confess I also read Francis Schaeffer, who no one knows who he is anymore.
Yeah, I did too. I read all his books when I was younger too. He really helped
you're
me.
Old enough to have remembered him, and he has his flaws, and he wasn't an expert on every topic he addressed, but at least he was trying to crystallize a Christian perspective on history and politics and society, and that I think inspired and energized a certain segment of conservative religious political advocacy in the 1970s and 1980s. Sometimes it was right, sometimes it's wrong, but if I had to think of a serious theorist today guiding religious political advocacy, they're few and far between. So at least he was making serious attempts to apply the faith to how we understand society.
That's good. Well, thank you. So, Mark, I wanted to just ask if is there any question that you wish I would have asked you today that you might want to answer? Or do you feel like we've been able to pick your brain and bring out some of your best thinking on politics, democracy, the Christian faith? Is there anything you wish I would have asked you?
Well, since you're a professor at a leading, not just Methodist, but American seminary, it is really essential that Christian schools, both seminaries and universities and colleges, are going to have to address issues of political theology seriously. My impression, perhaps not entirely correct, is that even the best schools are not really addressing political theology. They might be teaching political science or political history, but in terms of lifting up the traditions of the faith, in terms of how we understand God's purposes for government, my impression is that's not being done comprehensively. So we're going to have to start doing it.
I think
I mean you all are going to have to start doing it.
No, I think that's right. I think that's a good observation, and I think that's a good word. And so, so thank you for that. So if folks want to find out more about your work at IRD, what are the best places online where folks can engage with your work, get your updates?
You can come to our website, which is theird.org, theird.org. We have our daily blog called Juicy Ecumenism, which it links to, and also we have a publication called Christianity, a journal of Christianity, and I'm sorry, I'm having a brain blip, so I'll just call it Providence, a journal of Christianity, American Foreign Policy, but it's not just about American foreign policy. It's a journal of Christian realism and trying to understand political theology and how we try to modestly understand God's potential purposes for America. So Providence is a little bit more highbrow, I'll say, and maybe Juicy Ecumenism is maybe a little bit more for, not lowbrow certainly, but not quite as soaring or academic as Providence tends to be. But hopefully listeners will enjoy both.
And I'll put links to all those. Also, give links to what your work on Twitter, and links to, you're the author of a couple of books also. So I'll get those linked up for our audience. Mark, I just want to thank you so much for your time today. It's been a real privilege having you on the Deep Dive Spirituality Conversations podcast.
Thank you, Brian. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you. And everyone, thanks for listening. And until next time, live by faith, be known by love, and be voices of hope in a world that desperately needs it. Amen. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of the Deep Dive Spirituality Conversations podcast. It's a real privilege to have you as a listener. And if you found this episode to be helpful, would you consider sharing it with a friend, and also leaving a review that would help other people to find it? If you're interested in the materials that my guests talked about, I do have links that take you to Amazon. They're affiliate links. They help if you purchase things. It doesn't affect your price, but it does help to support the podcast. And also, if you're interested in group coaching specifically designed for the needs and growth of pastors and spiritual leaders, I'd invite you to take a look at www.deepdivespirituality.com. If I can serve you in any way, reach out to me. You can send an email at deepdivespirituality@gmail.com. Again, thank you for listening, and we'll see you next week.